everybody. I am reading from The Landmark History of the American People, chapter 24. During the Civil War, many farmers in both North and South prospered. There was a great demand for food to supply the armies. There were fewer people working on the farms, and the prices for farm products went up. But within a few years after Appomattox, the farmers' troubles began. Remember, Appomattox was the end of the Civil War. A bushel of wheat had sold in 1873 for $1.21. 12 years later, it had gone down to 49 cents. A pound of cotton cost 21 cents in 1873, but 20 years later, you could buy it for 5 cents. But the farmers' expenses had gone up. So how much they were making went down, but their expenses went up. Millions of farmers, like many homeowners today, were buying their farms on mortgage loans. In good times and bad, the farmer had to make regular payments. The heartless sheriff with a long mustache who threatened to foreclose the mortgage was no joke to the poor farmer between about 1870 and 1900. In God we trusted, the farmer saying went, and in Kansas we busted. In the Depression of 1893, when factories closed, many unemployed workers went back to the farm and added to the farmers' burdens. Banks foreclosed their mortgages. Farm families walked the country roads in desperation. But they did not take their troubles lying down. As early as 1867, they had begun to organize. Within 10 years, the Patrons of Husbandry had members all over the country. They met in 20,000 local lodges they called granges. On the 4th of July, 1873, groups of farmers met to hear a farmer's Declaration of Independence. And here's a political cartoon here on the page, the left page. It says political cartoons were used a great deal to make politicians and other social leaders look foolish so people would question their leadership. Louis Dalrymple, the famous cartoonist, published this cartoon in Puck on September 30, 1896, 6 weeks before the presidential election. The cartoon showed the Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan and his band of supporters ready to do battle with broomsticks and swords against a huge army of soldiers who had guns and cannons. The caption reads, "In the battle array, there is not much doubt about the result." From looking at the picture, is there any doubt about what the result of this election would be? That isn't really related to what we're reading, but it's an example of a political cartoon. In July 1892, farmers who believed they needed their own political party formed a Farmers' Alliance and organized the Populist Party in Omaha, Nebraska. Crusaders like the rabble-rousing Tom Watson of Georgia spoke for them in Congress, and they spoke loud and clear. "Before I will give up this fight," Watson warned, "I will stay here till the ants tote me out of the keyhole." One of the farmers' loudest demands was for cheap money. That meant a high price for wheat, corn, and cotton. The farmers who were always in debt were most worried about how to keep up the yearly payments on their mortgages so they could hold on to their farms. Suppose, for example, that a farmer owned $500 on his mortgage every year. Then if the price of wheat was $1 a bushel, he would have to raise 500 bushels of wheat to pay the $500. But if there was cheap money, say if the price of wheat went up to $2 a bushel, then the farmer could pay off his yearly debt by selling only 250 barrels of wheat bushels. Of course, the banker to whom the farmer owned the $500 each year would rather have seen all the prices kept down, so the money he received would buy more things. Cheap money meant finding ways for the government to mint as much money as possible. The more money available, the more likely people would pay higher prices for farm produce. On the other hand, the bankers were against cheap money. They wanted hard money. They wanted the gold standard. This meant keeping gold as the only basis for money. Since the amount of gold was extremely limited and was not likely to increase much, the gold standard was the one way of keeping prices down. In the 1860s, explorers found large new deposits of silver in Nevada, Colorado, and elsewhere in the West. The farmers realized that if the government was required to mint all this silver into money, then the quantity of money would increase greatly. The price of wheat, corn, and cotton would go up, and the farmers' problems might be solved. This program for minting silver was called free silver. By free, they meant unlimited coining of silver into dollars. Free silver, then, had a surefire appeal. It appealed to debt-burdened city laborers, as well as debt-burdened farmers all over the country. And it appealed also to miners and prospectors in the western states who wanted a guaranteed market for their silver. When the farmers put together their Populist Party to run their own candidates in the presidential election of 1892, they demanded free silver. The farmers' colorful leaders were not afraid to shock the comfortable people. The handsome, unladylike Mary Elizabeth Lease of Kansas was the mother of 4. What you farmers need to do, she urged, is to raise less corn and more hell. She also said, Wall Street owns the country. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street. The great common people of this country are slaves, and monopoly is the master. So there's a picture of her there, and it said she contributed mightily to creating the People's or Populist Party in 1892. By the mid-1890s, however, many party leaders wanted her gone. They were convinced her foul-mouthed speeches offended too many people. So Lease left the party and took up stumping for women's suffrage and the temperance movement. Color engraving is from a photo of 1890 there of her. Then also from Kansas, there was Sockless Jerry Simpson. Once when he ran for Congress, he accused his well-dressed opponent of wearing silk stockings. A reporter then sneered that Simpson was so crude that he wore no socks at all. Simpson made this into a boast, always after he was known as Sockless Jerry. The famous farmer orator Ignatius Donnelly came to be known as the Sage of Nininger, after the town he had tried to build. Before the Civil War, he had bought some Minnesota land and hoped to get rich by making it into a boom town. When the town died, he plowed up what was supposed to be city lots and downtown streets, planted them with wheat, and became a farmer. Donnelly wrote many books, and he loved outlandish ideas. His great cryptogram in 1888 offered a secret code that he said proved Sir Francis Bacon had actually written the plays of Shakespeare. Donnelly could attract a crowd anywhere. Some people were afraid to go to hear him because they feared he would make them believe things against their will. When the regular Democratic and Republican politicians saw the appeal of these farm crusaders, they naturally wanted to steal the populist thunder. The populist platform of 1892 demanded many different reforms, but what would appeal most to the farmers was one cure-all, a single reform that would solve all of their problems at once. It was not hard to believe that the cure-all might be free silver. There was something magical and mysterious about money. The amounts of money somehow seemed to change the value of everything else. Money seemed a medicine for everyone's ills. Many Democrats and Republicans were especially, that light is like right behind my head. Many Democrats and Republicans were especially afraid to see the country get into a control of a third party. They called populists the lunatic fringe. Inside the regular parties, the most successful of the farm crusaders was William Jennings Bryan. And that's a picture of him there. I guess that's from 1896. It doesn't look like a picture from 1896, but some called him the Great Commoner because he championed the common people. Others called him the Prairie Avenger or the Boy Orator of the Platte, after the Nebraska River near his home. Born in Salem, Illinois, he studied law in Chicago, and then he practiced law in small towns. He distrusted rich people and people of good family. Bryan had a holier-than-thou way of speaking. He liked to preach against sin. Proud that he did not drink, smoke, or gamble, he was always telling others how to behave. He also had a great appetite. One of his Sunday school classmates recalled that Bryan was too good a boy to help steal the watermelons, but he would enjoy eating them when the other boys had secured the booty. Booty is the stolen stuff. As a boy, he would carry around bread in his pockets for an emergency. His enormous appetite became famous. While campaigning, he often ate 6 full meals a day. A tall man of great energy, Bryan loved a political battle, and he had a talent for making every issue seem very simple. After he had explained it, every political battle seemed to be between Bryan and God on one side and his opponents and Satan on the other. His enemies said Bryan did not really understand how complicated the problems were. Even his friends had to admit that what made him famous was not his sharp mind, but his loud musical voice. And here we have President McKinley on his porch in 1896. This is 1901, 5 years after he won against Bryan, and a half year after he beat him again in 1900. The silver-tongued William Jennings Bryan had decided that free silver would cure the ills of all humanity. When Bryan arrived at the Democratic Convention of Chicago, on July 7, 1896, he was 36 years old, 1 year over the minimum age for a president. He had served only 4 years in Congress, and almost no one outside of Nebraska had heard of him. Unlike the other leading candidates, he did not have rich supporters. As the Democratic Party convention gathered, no one had decided whether the party should stay with the gold standard or whether it would join the farmers in their pursuit of free silver. President Grover Grover Cleveland, the Democrat in the White House, was strong for the gold standard, but he had lost the support of many laborers and farmers by using federal troops against the railroad workers in the big strike at Pullman. He had a reputation as a spokesman for big business. Until Bryan came to the platform, the speakers at the Chicago convention had been dull and long-winded. Since there was no public address system, most of the speakers could hardly be heard. Bryan was the final speaker, and he spoke about free silver. This was his great chance. The first sound of his ringing voice awakened the perspiring audience. They responded to his words with laughter and applause, like a trained choir. As he said, down to his last syllable, he spoke without hesitating. After all, he had given substantially the same speech many times before to farm audiences all over Nebraska. We will answer their demand for a gold standard, he ended by saying to them, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The crowd went wild. Their yelling and cheering lasted for an hour. The delegates from Alabama led a grand march of glory around the hall. Others reached for Bryan, proud even to touch his coat. They lifted him and marched him in triumph. After they put him back in his seat, admirers sat in his lap, hugged him until his collar wilted, shook his hand, shouted into his ears, danced all over his feet, and hemmed him in until he could scarcely get his breath. This one speech had transformed a Nebraska small-town lawyer into a front-runner for president. The next day, the Democratic Convention voted him to lead their ticket. Bryan was a rousing candidate. From millions of admirers, he received all kinds of gifts. Ostrich eggs, a stuffed alligator, 4 live eagles, a cane supposed to have belonged to Andrew Jackson, lots of rabbit's feet. If all the people who had given me rabbit's feet in this campaign will vote for me, there is no possible doubt of my election. The campaign offered one of the most spectacular contrasts in American history. The boy orator of Platte, which is the name of a river in Nebraska, went catering about the country by train, making speeches far into the night at every little town and often in between. On some days, he made 36 speeches. That's like 3 speeches an hour while you're awake. That is crazy. The campaign offered one of the most spectacular contrasts in American history. Meanwhile, his conservative Republican opponent, William B. McKinley, who was in the rocking chair on the previous page, remained calmly seated on his front porch in Canton, Ohio. McKinley made almost no speeches. When he did, he was careful to say nothing in particular, except that he was in favor of sound money, the gold standard, and restoring confidence. Mark Hanna was a clever businessman from Cleveland and a political boss. He was primarily responsible for acquiring the Republican nomination for McKinley, and he managed McKinley's campaign. Hanna counted on letting Bryan talk himself to defeat, and he used every trick to convince voters that Bryan was a dangerous radical. For example, he persuaded some factory owners as a stunt to pay their workers in Mexican dollars, worth only 50 United States cents. This was supposed to show the workers what their wages would really be worth if Bryan won. Hanna's tactics succeeded. The election went to McKinley by a narrow margin, but Bryan had attracted so many votes that the Democratic leaders could not ignore him. Twice again, in 1900 and 1908, he was named the Democratic candidate for president, but he never won. But the age of reform had arrived. Free silver, the simple-minded cure-all, was never adopted. But other populist reforms, the regulation of railroad rates, control of monopolies, limits on the hours of labor, and a federal income tax all became law. The populists had done more than anybody else to advertise the farmers' troubles, and the big old parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, got the message. They adopted the main populist reforms as their own. The populists, who had lost many noisy battles, finally won a silent victory. And I wanted to show you guys something. See if I can find it here. I don't think I can find it. I wanted to find... Yeah, I don't have... Yeah, I've got a video that I think will help with this, but I'll attach it separately so you can really understand what this free silver thing was about, because it was a little foreign to me. I had never really understood what the free silver meant. So I'm going to have a video you can watch actually before this that will help explain it for when you watch this. And then in chapter 24 here, there were a couple of questions. Husbandry, use the word husbandry, is caring, cultivating, and breeding crops and animals. And it also talks about Francis Bacon, but I don't remember using his name in there, but So when farmers used the phrase cheap money, what they wanted was inflated money that created a higher price for their product so they could pay the mortgage. The difference between cheap money and hard money is cheap money involves the government minting as much money as possible, making, like, the government makes the money, right? So make more and more and more money. So people had to pay higher prices. And hard money keeps gold as the standard or basis for money. The Democrats and Republicans were all wary of the Populist Party because it was a third political party, and they were worried about a third political party stepping in. The Populist Party pushed for more governmental control through the regulation of railroad routes, the control of monopolies, limits on hours of labor, and federal income tax. All passed and became platforms for all of the parties. So a few timeline and map points. The National Grange formed in 1867. The Populist Party demanded free silver, introducing inflation in 1892. And progressive legislation controlled rates, wages, hours of labor, and a federal income tax from 1903 to 1913. So those were just some things in chapter 24, but I'm also going to have a video hopefully to help you understand a little bit about the silver issue.